Dawn breaks against a river of smoke. Steel cables groan under tension, thick as a man's torso, trembling as the load begins to move. The ground shudders, not from an earthquake, but from intent. 3,000 tons of steel lean forward on rails, polished smooth by repetition. The beast wakes. Boilers thunder deep in its chest. Pistons the size of rail cars drive forward with pitiless rhythm. Each stroke drags stone from the earth, each pause filled with the hiss of pressure and the smell of hot oil. Men scatter along the margins, boots slick with mud and coal dust, eyes fixed on warning flags snapping in the wind. One missed signal here means crushed bone, flattened flesh, erased names. The machine does not slow. It never slows. A foreman's whistle cuts through the roar, shrill and futile. The load shifts. Steel screams. And somewhere beneath the mass, a man slips. There is no shout, only the sudden absence where a body had been. The beast continues, indifferent, dragging the continent into a new shape. This machine was not built to kill. It was built to move mountains, to straighten rivers, to carve channels for cities yet unimagined. It was designed to make distance irrelevant, to turn wilderness into grids and schedules. With it came bridges that spanned impossible gaps, ports that swallowed oceans of cargo, skylines that rose on foundations of relocated Earth. Progress arrived on iron tracks, but every advance demanded a price measured in blood and hours. 12-hour shifts beneath suspended loads, heat that blistered skin through wool, noise that hollowed ears until silence itself became unbearable, safety rules written after funerals, compensation paid in envelopes that could not replace hands. The beast did not choose its victims. It obeyed force and command, converting pressure into motion with flawless obedience. Men fed it coal, steel, and themselves. Cities rose behind it, proud and permanent. Graves followed in its wake, unmarked and forgotten. As the sun climbs higher, the machine completes another pull. The earth yields, the line advances, and the question hangs in the smoke, unanswered and heavy. How many lives can a civilization afford to spend to make itself stand? The paradox was simple, brutal, and unavoidable. The same force that lifted cities out of mud also pressed men into it. The machine existed to solve a problem no human body could endure: the relocation of millions of tons of earth, stone, and steel across distances measured in hundreds of miles. And without it, rivers remained crooked, ports shallow, railways incomplete. With it, the continent could be reordered. But the price of that order was paid at ground level, where flesh met force. Every calculation behind the machine treated weight as an abstract number. 3,000 tons was a specification, not a threat. Pressure was expressed in ratios, momentum in tables. Yet for the men beneath suspended loads, weight was not theoretical. It was the certainty that gravity never negotiated. Each movement of the beast converted equations into consequences. Progress arrived not as an idea, but as a descending mass. The machine promised efficiency. It replaced thousands of shovel strokes with a single pull. It compressed years of labor into weeks, months into days. Investors saw timetables shrink. Governments saw borders stabilize. Engineers saw elegance in scale. The ledger showed gains measured in currency, acreage, and throughput. What it did not show were the hours shaved from human lives, or the margin of error, where a man became debris. This was the contradiction at the heart of industrial expansion. Civilization demanded speed and uniformity. Human bodies provided neither. The machine bridged that gap by making individual loss statistically acceptable. Accidents became tolerances. Deaths became delays. When a worker was crushed, the schedule absorbed him without protest. Replacement labor arrived before the oil cooled. Yet the beast was never framed as cruel. It was described as necessary. Newspapers praised its capacity, not its casualties. Official reports catalogued output while relegating injuries to footnotes. The machine did not swing its arm in anger. It followed commands precisely. Responsibility dissolved into layers: designer, contractor, foreman, operator. No single hand pushed the fatal lever. All of them did. The paradox deepened as cities rose. Streets paved over former swamps. Buildings anchored to ground the machine had reshaped. Families moved into homes made possible by its work. The dead did not inhabit these spaces. Their absence was complete, efficient, and final. The same mechanism that erased rivers also erased memory. This tension was not accidental. It was engineered alongside the steel. Contracts rewarded speed, not survival. Delays were penalized. Injuries were not. Each incentive leaned toward motion at any cost. The beast, therefore, became a moral instrument without a conscience, translating collective ambition into physical action. Its legacy would force a reckoning not with machinery, but with the values that set it in motion. Those values, once embedded, proved harder to dismantle than any structure the machine ever built or destroyed. The machine did not emerge from ambition alone. It was summoned by pressure. Economic, geographic, and political forces converging with unforgiving precision. By the late industrial age, the continent faced a bottleneck of its own making. Raw materials lay stranded behind rivers that refused to be straightened and terrain that resisted manual labor. Coalfields waited inland. Timber stood unreachable. Ore sat beneath hills that could not be moved fast enough to satisfy demand. Expansion had outpaced the tools meant to sustain it. Railways ended where gradients grew steep. Ports choked on silt. Floodplains swallowed infrastructure each spring, undoing years of work in weeks. Governments demanded solutions that matched the scale of their promises. Cities were growing faster than their foundations could support. Factories required steady inputs, uninterrupted by geography. The map itself had become an obstacle. Labor alone could not solve this crisis. Even armies of workers failed against deadlines imposed by markets and politics. Shovels broke bodies long before they reshaped landscapes. Dynamite accelerated progress but introduced chaos, injury, and imprecision. What was needed was not more effort, but controlled force. Repeatable, predictable, relentless. The pressure intensified during periods of national competition. Strategic materials had to move faster than rivals. Inland routes became matters of security, not convenience. Canals, rail corridors, and deep-water harbors were no longer optional projects. They were instruments of power. Delays carried consequences measured in lost contracts, weakened positions, and public unrest. Financial capital responded with conditional generosity. Funding flowed toward projects that promised certainty and speed. Investors demanded machines that could guarantee output regardless of weather, terrain, or human limitation. Time itself became a commodity. The machine that could compress it would dominate the age. Environmental resistance sharpened the crisis further. Rivers flooded unpredictably, carrying away embankments and men. Forests resisted clearing. Clay collapsed beneath weight. Each failure reinforced the belief that nature required domination, not negotiation. Smaller machines failed because they hesitated. This one would not. The political climate rewarded decisive spectacle. Massive projects demonstrated authority and progress simultaneously. A machine capable of reshaping entire regions became a symbol as much as a tool. Photographs of steel frames against open land reassured the public that control was being asserted. Order was coming. Yet beneath these justifications lay desperation. The old methods had reached their limits. The continent could no longer expand on muscle alone. Without a radical escalation in mechanical power, growth would stall, and with it, the structures built upon it. The crisis was therefore framed as unavoidable. Either the machine would be built or the future would narrow. In this context, hesitation appeared irresponsible. Warnings were dismissed as caution masquerading as wisdom. A risk was reframed as necessity. The ground was prepared not just physically, but psychologically. When the design was proposed, it did not shock. It relieved. At last, there was something heavy enough to answer the problem. The proposal began as a technical memorandum, dense with figures and conditional language. It described a machine heavier than any land-based mechanism previously assembled, designed not for precision, but for endurance. Its purpose was singular: to apply continuous force without fatigue, hesitation, or decline. Where men slowed, it would persist. Where terrain resisted, it would press harder. The design drew from existing technologies pushed beyond accepted limits. Steam power provided the muscle, multiplied through compound boilers arranged in parallel. Steel replaced iron in critical load paths, and not for elegance, but for survival. Redundancy was introduced where failure would be catastrophic, while other systems were stripped to their minimum viable form. Weight was embraced rather than avoided. Mass itself became a stabilizing feature. Funding arrived in stages, each release contingent on performance. Governments underwrote risk with public money, justifying expense as infrastructure investment. Private firms supplied components at scale, lured by long-term contracts and prestige. Entire foundries were repurposed to meet tolerances previously considered unnecessary. Steel production schedules bent around a single machine. Assembly transformed remote sites into temporary cities. Rail spurs were laid solely to deliver parts. Cranes were built to erect a crane. A housing rose for workers who would never see the machine completed before being reassigned or dismissed. The scale of coordination rivaled military logistics. Delays were punished. Speed was rewarded. When the beast first moved under its own power, observers recorded the moment with reverence. The ground trembled not violently but persistently, as if acknowledging a new constant. Initial tests focused on control rather than output. Engineers listened for irregular rhythms, watched gauges for instability, smelled for escaping steam. Adjustments followed, incremental and relentless. Deployment expanded rapidly. Once proven, the machine was sent wherever resistance remained. River bends were straightened. Embankments rose where floodplains had spread unchecked. Hills were cut down and relocated piece by piece. Oh, the beast did not conquer in dramatic bursts. It advanced through accumulation. Public narratives framed the machine as triumph. Newspapers printed images emphasizing scale over proximity. Workers appeared as silhouettes, anonymous and replaceable. The machine acquired a name not through branding, but through repetition. It became shorthand for progress itself. To oppose it was to oppose inevitability. Operational doctrine evolved around its presence. Projects were redesigned to exploit its capabilities. Timelines shortened. Budgets swelled. Smaller machines were relegated to support roles. Human labor shifted from primary force to auxiliary function. Men guided, signaled, and maintained. The machine acted. With each success, confidence hardened into dependence. The continent's transformation began to assume its availability. Our planners no longer asked whether landscapes could be changed, only how quickly. The beast was no longer experimental, it was essential. And with that shift, restraint vanished. The machine had proven it could move the earth. The question of what it might do to those caught beneath it went unasked. At full operation, the machine's mass exceeded 3,000 tons, distributed across a steel chassis reinforced with layered trusses and cross-bracing. The frame rested on articulated tracks designed to spread weight across unstable ground. Each segment adjusted independently, allowing the beast to advance where rigid platforms would have sunk or fractured. Movement was slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. Power originated in a bank of high-pressure steam boilers arranged along the central spine. Each boiler operated within a narrow thermal margin, producing force measured not in horsepower alone, but in sustained torque. Steam flowed through insulated conduits into compound pistons whose diameters rivaled small rooms. These pistons drove a system of reduction gears that converted vertical thrust into horizontal pull. Every motion was dampened to prevent sudden release. Violence was controlled, not eliminated. The primary hauling system consisted of braided steel cables rated well beyond expected load. These cables passed through sheaves machined to tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. Friction was the enemy. Heat buildup could weaken steel silently. To counter this, lubrication systems operated continuously, flooding contact points with oil that burned off in acrid smoke. Our operators learned to read the color of that smoke as carefully as gauges. Control stations were positioned at multiple elevations. No single operator commanded the entire machine. Instead, responsibility was segmented. One crew monitored pressure, another tracked alignment. Signalmen coordinated movement through flags and horns, translating intention into action through distance and noise. Communication failure was a known risk, accepted as inevitable. Redundancy existed only where absolute failure would halt operations. Safety systems were minimal by modern standards. Emergency stops required manual intervention and time. Momentum could not be cancelled instantly. Once engaged, a pull had to complete or dissipate naturally. The machine obeyed physics before it obeyed men. Maintenance occurred continuously. Bearings wore down within weeks, or steel fatigued under cyclic stress. Hairline fractures appeared in non-critical members and were plated over rather than replaced. Replacement parts were fabricated on site, often under pressure to resume work immediately. Downtime was treated as loss, not prevention. Fuel consumption was staggering. Coal deliveries arrived daily, feeding furnaces that never fully cooled. Water intake altered local supplies, diverting streams and lowering levels downstream. The machine reshaped not only terrain, but resource flows around it. Its presence imposed demands that rippled outward. Engineering reports emphasized performance metrics: load moved per hour, distance reshaped per day, cost per ton relocated. Human factors appeared only in appendices. Fatigue was acknowledged but not mitigated. Injury rates were tracked as statistics, not warnings. The machine functioned as designed. Its tolerances held. Its systems responded predictably. The danger lay not in malfunction, but in success. By achieving what smaller machines could not, it normalized exposure to forces no human could survive. The engineering was sound. The assumptions behind its use were not. The flaw was not a cracked beam or an undersized valve. It was embedded deeper in the logic that governed how the machine interacted with the men around it. The beast was engineered for maximum force under controlled conditions, but the environment it operated in was neither static nor fully controllable. Ground shifted. Weather altered traction. Human judgment varied under fatigue. The design assumed ideal coordination in a world that rarely provided it. Clearance zones were defined on paper, or marked by measured distances where no one was meant to stand. In practice, these zones collapsed under necessity. Cables had to be guided, loads had to be cleared of debris, signals had to be relayed across noise and steam. Men entered danger not out of recklessness, but because the work required it. The machine's reach extended beyond its documented envelope. The greatest hazard lay in stored energy. 3,000 tons in motion accumulated momentum that could not be halted instantly. A slipped cable, a misaligned pulley, or a delayed signal transformed controlled force into sudden release. When tension failed, it failed catastrophically. Steel recoiled with lethal speed. Loads dropped without warning. The design acknowledged this risk, but treated it as statistically manageable. Warning systems were primitive. Or pressure spikes could be read on gauges, but structural stress often announced itself only through sound. A change in pitch, a scream of metal under strain. Experienced workers learned to listen, but experience was uneven. New labor arrived constantly, replacing those injured or killed. Knowledge dissipated faster than it could be formalized. The machine also magnified small errors. A miscalculation of inches at the load translated into yards at the point of impact. Alignment issues compounded over distance. Once committed, corrections were limited. The beast did not improvise. It followed the path set before motion began. Any deviation became an emergency. Design reviews occasionally noted these dangers. Engineers recommended expanded buffers, improved signaling, reduced loads under certain conditions. Each recommendation collided with schedules and cost. Implementing them would slow progress, reduce output, and challenge the premise of efficiency that justified the machine's existence. Most suggestions were deferred. Some were ignored entirely. Management framed incidents as operational failures rather than design shortcomings. Blame settled on individuals, a signalman who hesitated, a worker who stepped too close, a crew that failed to clear a line. The system itself remained unquestioned. The beast continued to operate unchanged, its dangers accepted as background noise. Over time, this acceptance hardened into culture. Risk became normalized. Near misses were forgotten as quickly as they occurred. Survival was treated as proof of adequacy. Those who voiced concern were labeled cautious, even obstructive. The machine's reliability in moving Earth obscured its unreliability in preserving life. The hidden flaw, therefore, was not mechanical. It was the belief that force could be scaled without equally scaling care. That belief would not break steel. It would break people. Life beneath the beast followed a rhythm dictated by steam cycles and shift whistles. Days began before light, with men assembling in rows that blurred into one another. Laborers, riggers, firemen, signalers. Names mattered less than roles. Each man carried his tools and his fatigue forward, returning them at night if he survived intact. Shifts stretched 12 hours or more, extending when deadlines pressed. Heat radiated from boilers even in winter, turning enclosed spaces into furnaces. In summer, dehydration came quickly. Water breaks were informal, taken when opportunity allowed. Coal dust coated lungs and skin, mixing with sweat into a paste that never fully washed away. Hearing eroded slowly under constant thunder. Many workers learned to read lips without realizing it. Pay reflected danger only indirectly. Wages exceeded farm work but lagged behind the risk. Injuries threatened income immediately. Compensation systems were inconsistent, often delayed, sometimes denied. A crushed hand meant reassignment or dismissal. A crushed spine meant disappearance. The machine did not pause for funerals. Training was brief. New men learned by watching, imitating movements whose rationale was rarely explained. Veterans passed on warnings selectively, sometimes withholding them to preserve status or avoid blame. Trust formed in fragments. Signals were memorized under pressure. Their meanings drilled until instinct replaced thought. Mistakes carried consequences that rarely affected supervisors. Fear was constant but muted. To dwell on it was to lose focus. Workers developed rituals to manage it, touching certain bolts, standing in familiar spots, refusing specific tasks without explanation. Superstition filled gaps where policy failed. Luck was spoken of more often than safety. Injuries accumulated gradually. Burns from steam leaks, crushed fingers caught between cable and drum, falls from scaffolding slick with oil. Records captured severe incidents, but minor injuries blurred into routine. Pain became background noise, managed with alcohol and endurance. Absence was punished. Presence, no matter the condition, was rewarded. Despite this, pride persisted. Men took ownership of impossible tasks completed. And they pointed to altered landscapes and claimed authorship. The machine was powerful, but it required human guidance. Without their signals, maintenance, and nerve, it would sit inert. This belief sustained them. It also kept them close to danger. Death arrived without ceremony. When it occurred, work halted briefly to clear debris. Crews reassembled. The shift continued. Official reports used neutral language. Families received notices stripped of detail. Replacement labor arrived within days, sometimes hours. The beast resumed its rhythm, unchanged. Worker life was therefore defined by contradiction. The machine that depended on human presence rendered humans expendable. Survival required intimacy with danger. Leaving meant poverty elsewhere. Staying meant acceptance of risk that could not be mitigated. In this space, men endured not because they misunderstood the threat, but because they understood it completely and chose necessity over fear. The failure did not announce itself with drama. It began with a delay measured in seconds. A signal flag hesitated at the edge of visibility, caught between steam and glare. The load was already in motion. 3,000 tons advanced on momentum accumulated long before doubt arrived. Tension climbed through the cables, rising past nominal thresholds into a range operators rarely acknowledged. The sound changed first, a higher pitch, thinner, sharper. Experienced ears turned toward it, but reaction lagged behind physics. One pulley seized briefly, its lubrication burned away by heat. Friction spiked. Stress migrated along the line, searching for release. It found it. The cable failed not at the weakest point, but at the most fatigued. Steel unraveled in a violent recoil that moved faster than sight. The load dropped a fraction, then surged sideways. The ground buckled under redistributed weight. Men scattered, but distance was insufficient. One worker was struck before he could turn. Another disappeared beneath the shifting mass. The machine continued its cycle for several seconds, obeying commands issued before the failure, converting stored energy into destruction. Emergency stops were pulled. Valves slammed shut. Steam vented in white eruptions that blinded crews rushing forward. Silence followed, unnatural and absolute. Where the load had passed, the ground was torn open. Tools lay scattered. Helmets rested where heads no longer did. Recovery operations began immediately, not for the dead, but for the machine. Inspectors assessed damage, prioritizing components that threatened prolonged shutdown. Bodies were removed after pathways were cleared. Names were recorded. Causes were summarized. Production loss was calculated before grief had space to form. The incident could not be hidden. Too many had seen it. Too many had been lost. Work stopped longer than usual. Crews refused to resume without assurances that could not be credibly given. Management arrived in force, armed with explanations framed as anomalies. They cited rare convergence of errors, unforeseeable circumstances. The machine, they insisted, remained sound. Workers responded with refusal, not organized at first, but collective. They stepped back from control stations. Signals went unanswered. The beast sat idle, steam bleeding away uselessly. This stillness carried weight. For the first time, the machine was present but powerless. Negotiations followed, tense and asymmetrical. Demands focused on spacing, signaling reforms, reduced loads. Management countered with minimal concessions, warning of replacement labor and contract penalties. The standoff stretched hours into days. Public attention grew. Photographs circulated showing the scale of the machine beside the smallness of the men confronting it. Resolution arrived through compromise, not justice. Limited safety changes were implemented. A memorial was erected near the site, modest and quickly forgotten. Work resumed under revised protocols that altered margins but preserved pace. The machine moved again, its rhythm restored. The disaster marked a boundary. It exposed limits previously ignored, forced acknowledgement of risk long denied. But it did not dismantle the system that produced it. The beast had killed openly, and still it remained indispensable. The confrontation proved not that the machine was too dangerous to use, but that even catastrophe could be absorbed without fundamental change. The disaster rippled beyond the immediate site. Legal inquiries were convened, but they emphasized procedure rather than accountability. Regulations were adjusted, often in technical language, codifying minimum safety buffers without altering operational tempo. Inspectors were mandated to monitor compliance, but resources were limited. Enforcement lagged behind expectation, and in many cases, documentation substituted for action. Insurance assessments reflected both the scale of exposure and the political weight of industrial stakeholders. Premiums rose slightly, but underwriting assumed risk as inherent. Policies covered replacement labor, partial infrastructure damage, and machinery repair, not human loss. Families of victims received one-time payments, often insufficient to compensate for permanent disability or trauma. Public perception absorbed these transactions with quiet resignation. Industry-wide, the event prompted replication of limited safety measures, yet ambition remained untamed. Other machines were reviewed, but the fundamental doctrine, maximize throughput, minimize delay, was unchanged. The narrative of necessity persisted. The continent's transformation required risk. Men were expendable within defined tolerances. Machinery, by contrast, was sacred. Worker culture shifted subtly. Crews incorporated procedural adaptations designed to protect life. Yet these became habits rather than principles. The incident was remembered as a warning, but also as an inevitability. Manuals were rewritten to include case studies of the failure, framed as lessons in precision and discipline. Emotion was edited out. Political and economic actors leveraged the event selectively. Funding agencies highlighted the machine's ability to resume operations rapidly. Government agencies praised output recovery. Histories were drafted emphasizing achievement, marginalizing fatalities. The record celebrated resilience and ingenuity, not mortality. Technological doctrine evolved cautiously. Engineering teams implemented redundancies where feasible, improved monitoring, and experimented with shock-absorbing systems. Yet these innovations were incremental. The machine's scale remained beyond full human control, while it continued to demand oversight, skill, and endurance in combination with mechanical perfection. Any systemic flaw could still manifest catastrophically. Across the continent, other projects took note. Risk became codified, routinized, and internalized. Managers treated near misses as data points. Workers treated them as lessons in survival. The disaster did not end industrial ambition. It intensified it, reinforcing the belief that scale justified danger. The machine was no longer just a tool, it was a precedent, shaping policy, procedure, and culture. Ultimately, the consequences extended beyond engineering or labor. They touched ethics, governance, and societal expectation. The beast had proven both indispensable and lethal, forcing a society to reconcile progress with mortality. The compromise reached, partial reform, or ongoing exploitation, would define industrial practice for decades. Decades passed, yet the imprint of the beast remained visible across landscapes it had reshaped. Rivers ran straighter, embankments rose higher, and valleys once impassable now bore roads and railways. Entire cities owed their layout to the paths it had carved, their foundations stabilized on earth, moved by relentless mechanical force. Bridges spanned distances previously considered impossible, and ports could receive ships previously grounded by shallow water. The continent itself had been organized according to the machine's logic: efficiency, permanence, and scale. Yet the legacy was double-edged. Sites of work retained scars: compacted soil that resisted agriculture, shifted wetlands that altered ecosystems, and abandoned support structures, cranes, scaffolds, and rail spurs, rusting into silence. For every architectural triumph, there was a hidden trace of cost. Graves were unmarked, memorials minimal, and the human toll obscured beneath steel and stone. Children who grew up in these cities saw progress as natural, never questioning that the ground beneath their homes had been moved by men and steel in equal measure. Cultural memory fragmented. Histories recorded achievements, enumerating tons relocated, miles of track laid, and structures completed. Photographs immortalized the scale but anonymized the labor. Worker deaths, injuries, and hardship became footnotes in official accounts. Yet oral histories persisted, stories passed from one generation of families to the next, emphasizing both pride and caution. They spoke of deafening roar, of heat that blistered skin, of lives lost in the shadow of the machine. The machine itself eventually fell silent, retired when more efficient systems emerged. Yet even in stillness, it continued to instruct. Engineers studied its design to understand endurance under extreme load. Industrial planners referenced its operation when imagining new megaprojects. It became a symbol of human ambition harnessed through iron and fire, and simultaneously a warning of hubris. The moral question it embodied, the price of progress, remained unresolved. Urban centers built atop its work prospered, yet they were inseparable from the labor that had enabled them. Roads, canals, and foundations bore witness to the human cost, encoded in the spatial rhythm of streets and the height of levees. Economic growth was undeniable, but so was the shadow it cast. A civilization constructed atop lives measured in hours, injuries, and absence. The 3,000-ton steel beast, though dormant, continued to exert influence. It defined engineering expectation, set precedent for acceptable risk, and reshaped not only the terrain but the collective understanding of sacrifice and achievement. Progress and destruction had moved together, inseparable, leaving an imprint both visible and moral. Standing before the rusted frame of the beast, it is impossible to separate awe from unease. Its skeletal steel stretches across the horizon, massive, unyielding, a monument to both human ingenuity and human cost. The air still carries the faint tang of oil and iron, as if the machine itself has not fully released its presence. Time has dulled the roar, yet memory preserves it sharply. The trembling ground, the hiss of boilers, the tension in the cables that held both earth and men. Historians debate the scale of sacrifice. Some quantify it in lives lost, and others in injuries or hours of labor. But the deeper reckoning lies beyond measurement. The machine forced a civilization to confront a fundamental question. What is expendable in the pursuit of progress? It demanded answers that were never fully resolved. Its work built cities, straightened rivers, and forged empires of steel and concrete. But it also built absence, leaving voids in communities and in consciousness. The beast's legacy persists in infrastructure, in industrial doctrine, and in the collective imagination. Engineers continue to study its systems, marveling at endurance, efficiency, and sheer mechanical audacity. Yet every calculation acknowledges the paradox it embodied, that the same force capable of constructing wonders was equally capable of erasing life. Its lessons are technical, yes, but moral as well. The weight of 3,000 tons becomes inseparable from the weight of human expectation and human cost. Even the landscapes it shaped carry dual narratives. Bridges and ports signal triumph. Compacted floodplains, rusting scaffolds, and unmarked burial grounds whisper of danger endured and often ignored. Civilization flourished atop labor that was largely invisible, yet the contours of progress remain inseparable from those who paid for it. To walk these sites is to witness both achievement and erasure simultaneously. Ultimately, the 3,000-ton steel beast remains more than a machine. It is a mirror reflecting ambition, ingenuity, and the ethical compromises that accompany them. Its presence challenges us to consider the true cost of transformation, the silent casualties behind monumental progress, and the persistent tension between human life and industrial necessity. Civilization was built in its shadow, shaped by force and endurance, and defined as much by what it preserved as by what it consumed. The echo of its engines lingers in memory, reminding all who study it that the boundaries of ambition are drawn not only by technical possibility, but by moral courage. A reminder that every empire, every city, every bridge carries the imprint of those who enabled it and those who were lost beneath it.